Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon. We would like to welcome all of you, members and guests, and those of you who may be watching on television or listening on the radio, to our regular Friday forum of the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Dick Pogue. I'm a former president of the City Club, and it's my distinct privilege to introduce today's speaker, who is Mustafa Akyol, whose very timely subject is Islam compatible with freedom? Mr. Akyol lives in Istanbul, Turkey, makes frequent trips to the United States. He's a renowned columnist on Turkish matters. He writes regularly for two Turkish newspapers, one of which is in English and one in Turkish. And he's a prolific writer and speaker in various subjects involving the Muslim faith. He has regular columns for the International New York Times and a number of other publications, including several in the Middle East. He also teaches politics and religion at a university in Istanbul, Fatih University, and he's a regular speaker on subjects in this general area on both the BBC Hard Talk and CNN's Fareed Zakaria GPS. He's published 6 books, the most recent of which is called Islam Without Extremes, which you will hear about today. This book was praised by the Financial Times of London, and I quote, as a forthright and elegant Muslim defense of freedom. It's a fascinating book. I've had the opportunity to read it. It reviews the 14th century history of Islam from the year 1610, which those of you who are students of this subject know was the year in which an Arab man named Muhammad, who lived in a small town, Mecca, in what is now Saudi Arabia, heard an extraordinary voice in a cave, which started the religion. I don't want to steal his thunder, but in his introduction to this book, Muslim Without Extremes, there's one quotation, I think, that summarizes his point of view on these matters. And I'm quoting, "Ultimately, I have become convinced that a fundamental need for the contemporary Muslim world is to embrace liberty, the liberty of individuals and communities, Muslims and non-Muslims, believers and unbelievers, women and men, ideas, opinions, markets, and entrepreneurs. So it's with great admiration that I present a very brave and thoughtful commentator on liberalism in today's modern world, Mustafa Akyol."
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thanks for this very generous introduction in the first place. Thanks to the Cleveland Book Club for inviting me months ago to have the privilege to be with you today. And thanks to all of you, for sparing time and being with us and breaking bread. And some of us are not eating because it's Ramadan, and that's also very respectful for Muslims. And I eat because I'm on travel, so it's complicated, but we should honor that as well. And I should also begin maybe by saying that I offer my condolences to the American people, especially families in Orlando, about the horrible thing that happened there. I heard the news when I was packing for the US, and I felt sad for 2 reasons. I felt sad for the people who lost their, innocent people who lost their lives or were ruthlessly killed. And I felt sad because the murderer happened to be somebody who supposedly acted in the name of my faith. And I agree with the American Muslim leaders, hundreds of them signed a recent declaration on Orlando saying they condemn this wholeheartedly and it cannot be justified from the grounds of Islam or any other religion. So let me also mention that. But I don't want to begin with sad stories. I want to tell you actually a not so sad story of mine, my personal story. It's a story that comes from the very first trip I had to the United States some 20 years ago. 20 years ago, I was a younger man. And, and I was excited to see America, the land of Rocky Balboa for me. And I came here to visit a friend of mine who lives in the US, and and he showed me around, he took me to places. I loved everything I saw from New York to California. We had a great time. One morning we were hungry, and he said, let's have breakfast. I said, sure. And he said, let's go to McDonald's. I said, will we eat burgers for breakfast? He said, no, McDonald's has breakfast. I said, okay, let me see what that is. So we went in, and he bought me a breakfast menu. And that was the first time in my life that I saw and tasted pancakes. We didn't have pancakes in Turkey. So he showed me how to put the syrup and the butter, and it sucked all of it. And I tasted it, and I said, man, this is the most delicious thing I ever had in my life. So I just fell in love with pancakes. I went back to Turkey. Next year, I came again for another summer vacation. And I wanted to have pancakes, right? But I had a misunderstanding. I was thinking that pancakes are an exclusive McDonald's product. So I was desperate to find a McDonald's restaurant before 10:30 a.m. because I had figured out they changed it to lunch menu at 10:30 to get the pancakes, right? And it went on for a few days. And in the third day, I was walking around with my brother, who's actually with us here today. And I saw a non-McDonald's restaurant which said, we serve pancakes. I said, they stole it from McDonald's. So it took a while to realize that pancakes are a larger phenomenon, than McDonald's. And, you can find it everywhere. And I also took a lesson from that story a couple of years and maybe a decade later. And the lesson was that a foreign culture might be a little confusing when you meet it for the first time. You might have a hard time in understanding its peculiarities. And if you misunderstand the cuisine of a different culture, it's easy. You'll figure out baklavas, pancakes, whatever that is. It's not that difficult. But if we misunderstand the values, the politics, the history, the religion of a different culture, a whole different civilization, sometimes that's a bigger gap to fill. And as somebody who is in the media, I think that in this day and age in the world, we are very prone to misunderstanding different cultures because of the media, which actually brings us a lot of information about foreign cultures, right? We hear about, you open the evening news, you get news from all over, countries that you've never been to. But you hear the bombings and the killings and all the horrible stuff that's going on there, because the media brings us what bleeds, that's what leads. But you don't hear about the normal people who live there and their normal lives and their issues. In other words, media brings to our attention the disturbing, the shocking elements about societies that we don't know. So since 9/11, understandably, Americans have heard a lot of horrible news about the extremists in our part of the world, which do exist, which are a big problem, which do threaten us as well too. But they are not the only thing about, of course, Islam, this great civilization and the Muslim world. But let me tell you one thing. The same dynamic is working on our side as well. In other words, the news people hear in the Middle East that are coming from the West do not reflect the nicest voices from the West. It reflects emphasizes the not so likable voices that are coming from the West. Let me tell you, for example, an example. In 2012, I made a research to figure out which American religious leader appeared most frequently in the Turkish media. The research, which I'll admit was simple, it was a Google search, which took 7 seconds. I just typed the word pastor in Turkish and see what comes out. And it showed me that the most frequently quoted American religious leader in the Turkish media was the gentleman in Florida who wanted to burn a copy of the Quran. I understand it's his constitutional right. I'm not against people's rights. But you can use your constitutional rights in a polite way and in an offensive way. It was a kind of offensive way he used. But what is important is that I know many prominent Christian leaders said, don't do this. This is wrong. You shouldn't offend these people. But they didn't make the news. I woke up actually in Turkey one day and I check a website, and popular website, it says, now they are burning our Quran. It was not they, it was a leader of a small denomination in Florida who had a certain view of expressing his opinions. Therefore, we should be careful not to fall into that trap. And that is why sometimes when I speak to Western audiences, I find myself telling, they're actually not that bad, the other side. And I tell the same thing to my fellow Muslims. When I speak in Turkey, when I speak in Malaysia, when I speak in the Muslim world, I say, the West is actually not that evil as you think. There are good people there and they are questioning things. And because they have a very negative image, selected, colonials and whatever, they have a certain image of the West. And that's why we need conversation. That's why we, instead of just looking at that world and looking at the fanatics among them and painting a picture. However, I'm not here to tell you that everything is relative and we should just understand each other. I'm also here to speak about some real problems in the Muslim world today. Because yes, the fanatics don't define us. Yes, the authoritarian Muslims don't define all Muslims, but we do have them. We do have these problems. We do have ISIS, we do have Al-Qaeda, and how these groups came out and what's the origin of their theology, their philosophy, and what drives them, their ideology. We have to face these things. And that's one of the things I'm trying to do with my writings. But I'll tell you something, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, these groups are very marginal. They make a big impact because of their violence, but they're very marginal. But I sometimes see a broader problem in the Muslim world, not just coming from these very extreme groups, but even in not extreme countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan, even in Turkey sometimes, you have what I call a very authoritarian understanding of religion. Like a kind of understanding which imposes religion on people, which forces people to be religious, or punishes blasphemy, punishes apostasy. So that is my problem. And I wanted to write a book about this particular problem. And that's why I kept asking, is Islam compatible with freedom? Why I was interested in this? Another story. 10 years ago, I went to Saudi Arabia for actually religious duty. Then I went to Jeddah, and from there I took a plane to Istanbul, right? Every female in Saudi Arabia has to be covered. That's by law. So all of them got on the plane covered. When we landed in Istanbul, half of them went to the bathroom. They came out with pretty mini skirts and everything. And I'm not against, let them wear whatever they like. But I said, Saudi Arabia is not actually creating piety here as it wants. It's just creating hypocrisy. It's just forcing people to be religious cannot make people religious. It can make people hypocritical. By the way, I also knew that when I read the Quran, 2 decades ago in the first place. In the Quran, there's a certain verse which says, there's no compulsion on religion. But why do we have so many compulsion in Iran, in Saudi Arabia? So why this is happening? So that's my main problem. And I'll tell you what the problem is in all these cases. Is Islam compatible with freedom? That's the question, right? If Islam is a matter of personal belief and practice, as it is for many, many Muslims, maybe the overwhelming majority of Muslims, it is not incompatible with freedom. You can fast in Ramadan, you can go to mosque and do your prayers. Maybe you can't do it in communist China, where the government bans it, call it superstition. You can freely do it in free societies like in the United States. That's why I have so many Muslim friends who love the US. They say, we can do it everywhere, anything here. We can go to mosque, we can open a mosque, we can pray. Nobody looks down upon us. Nobody thinks that we are backward-minded. That happens in Europe sometimes, Religion is seen as a little bit kind of awkward idea. But in free societies, many Muslims live peacefully and they appreciate the freedom they find there. There's no problem with personal practice. You can wear a headscarf if you believe so, that's wonderful. You can wear a miniskirt if you think that's a nicer way. I have respect for all of those. There's no problem of Islam being a personal practice. And that's why, thinking that all Muslims are out there to destroy freedom is a very wrong idea. But if Islam is understood as a legal system and a state structure based on that legal system, there are serious problems. Legal system, what do I mean? I'm speaking of Islamic law, Sharia, or fiqh, in jurisprudence, as it is put. There are serious problems in classical Islamic law about individual freedom. There's a ban on apostasy, there's a ban on blasphemy, there are clauses about punishing people for being gays or punishing people for being immoral or forcing them to do these things, which are religiously necessary. But I have an argument there. My book is all about the study of this authoritarian aspects of Islamic law. And my argument is that, first of all, they do not really come from the Quran, the only undisputed source of Islam. They come from the interpretations of Quran. And some words attributed to Prophet Muhammad, which is not 100% true or not, there's a big debate about those, and how they were interpreted by medieval scholars. And the main problem is that those injunctions you find in Islamic law are today taken literally, blindly literally, by these authoritarian-minded institutions and state systems. Now, let me try to explain what I mean blind literalism with an example. It's again from Saudi Arabia, my favorite country of examples of speaking of the problem of authoritarianism in Islam. If you have friends from Saudi Arabia here, with all due respect, I have great culture for Saudi values and society, but I have problems with certain institutions and mindsets. In Saudi Arabia, there are many bans. Many things are banned. There are no cinemas, there's no bars, there's lots of things are banned. One of the bans they have is that they don't allow women to drive cars. Maybe you heard about that. Probably you can't imagine how that would work in the US, right? You can't drive a car, you can't even go to a supermarket, that's how US generally society is. But in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive cars. Now, I've discussed this issue with Saudi scholars a couple of times. I said, why don't you allow women to drive cars? Well, they had different reasonings. They said, we want to protect them and blah, blah, blah. And at the end of the day, they say, Prophet Muhammad said so. And you ask, what did he exactly say about driving, in 7th century? There is a hadith saying, attributed to Prophet Muhammad. They quote that. It reads literally like this, quote, do not send women alone to the desert, end of quote. Do not send women alone to the desert. Now, I asked, how should we interpret this hadith to a Turkish authority on this, Professor Mehmet Görmez, who's the head of the official religious institution in Turkey. He was the head of a hadith project which was about revisiting all these sayings. He told me, Mustafa, at that time, between Mecca and Medina, in the desert, there were bandits. So they were attacking every unprotected caravan. So a woman walking alone in the desert would be prey to these people. So Prophet says something about that context. It shouldn't mean a woman should not be able to drive an SUV today, in the middle. But if you don't understand the intention and the context of that injunction, and if you say we'll blindly do this today, implement this today, you end up doing what the Saudis are doing when it comes to women. Now, there are other examples of blind literalism, and they cause even more serious problems than women not being able to driving. That's a big problem in itself, of course, too. And that is actually one of the major issues when this issue of Islam and freedom comes up. That is the issue of apostasy. Apostasy means, leaving your religion, right? You're a Muslim and one day you read the Bible, you're inspired and you say, I want to be a Christian, or you become a Buddhist. You become an atheist, you become something else. So in free societies, what do we do to apostates? Like, what do we don't do anything to them, right? It's their opinion, it's their fate, it's their feelings, and we have to respect. We can be sorry for that person, thinking that he's losing the true faith, but we can't do anything about it. And however, though, apostasy is a capital offense in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Sudan, Afghanistan, and it can lead to vigilante, violence in certain countries. And because in classical Islamic law, in major schools of Sharia, in Sunni and Shia, it is written apostasy is a crime punishable by death. Now, when I first studied this, I thought about like this. First of all, is there a reason? Is there a logic behind this? If somebody doesn't believe in Islam anymore, and if I can tell him, you're not supposed to leave Islam, even if you don't believe in, otherwise I'll kill you. Like, he can at best become a hypocrite. Like, what's the point of forcing somebody to stay in the religion? And it's not a great idea to also to tell to the world. I mean, we have a religion that you can enter, but you can't leave. Sounds like Hotel California, you can. Not a great idea. So there must be some problem with this. And I know in the Quran, there is nothing that bans apostasy. As I said, there's a very clear verse, let there be no compulsion in religion, la ikraha fid din. There's another verse which says the truth is from your Lord, let anyone who want to believe it, believe it. Let anyone who want to disbelieve it, disbelieve it. There is nothing in the Quran, as everybody knows, that penalizes apostasy. The Quran says unbelievers will go to hell, but that is an afterlife, and that's about God. That's not about doing something in this world. And if you don't believe in hell anymore at all, so it's not an issue for you anymore. Why then do we have a punishment for apostasy in classical Islamic law? Well, when you read the writings of medieval scholars who said apostasy is a crime that should be punished by death, you see something very interesting. Those scholars were living at a time when the Muslim community was at war with the Byzantine Romans and the pagan Sassanid Empire. And for them, an apostate was somebody who left the Muslim side and joined the enemy. So a tribe would leave, desert from the war and join the enemy. They would be called apostates. So they were just with the sword going to the other side to kill you. They were speaking of what we would call high treason today. And high treason is still not very tolerated in armies, at least in the world today. Now, that's, for example, why the Hanafi scholars, Hanafi school is the most lenient and progressive school in Sunni Islamic when it comes to jurisprudence. Hanafi scholars wrote that in medieval era. It says, apostates should be killed if they're males. Females don't count. This was not misogyny. There are examples of misogyny, but this was the simple recognition that women are not soldiers, so you're not concerned about them. You're concerned about the men who can join the enemy. Now, when you understand this context, you can say, okay, I understand why they thought apostasy must be a crime in the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. But we are living at a different time. Your fate doesn't define your army, your military obligations, and so on and so forth. It's a matter of personal choice. I mean, if you don't believe in Islam, you're free to leave it if you want so. And there are progressive scholars who say this. One of them is, for example, Rashid Ghannouchi of Tunisia. Actually, he's leading a very moderate Islamic movement in Tunisia, which contributed to the evolving democracy in that country. And he says, Islam should be based on freedom. You can't impose Islam on people. There was a very progressive Ayatollah in Iran who made the same argument, Ayatollah Montazeri. The regime didn't like him, but I liked him, for his ideas. And he said apostasy is not a crime, people can leave Islam. So these ideas are out there, and the war of ideas in the Muslim world is in that sense going on. And you can certainly go blindly literal and say all these things are written and we will implement these things without thinking about it, or you can try to understand the meaning of it, understand the purpose of it, and you can reinterpret it in the light of the modern age. And that battle is going on. But you can ask me, like, Mustafa, you look like a nice guy and you have these nice ideas, but are you an awkward person? Like, does nobody ever would listen to you? Well, I'm not a very important person. I'm not an imam. I'm not anything. But the ideas I'm trying to articulate are actually found in mainstream Islamic tradition. And there are reasons for change, and there are examples of change and reinterpretation in Islamic tradition. That's why in my book, I have a chapter on the late Ottoman Empire and the reforms in late Ottoman Empire, which is one of the nice chapters, I mean, if you want to read books, you know. And there I explain that the late Ottoman Empire, in its effort to incorporate a liberal democracy based on coming from Western institutions, they reformed all of these things. The Ottoman Empire let apostasy be free in the 19th century. The Ottoman Empire established a parliament with Jewish and Christian members. 1/3 of was Jewish and Christian, actually. The Ottoman Empire changed civil code. The Ottoman Empire stopped persecuting gays, and all in the 19th century. There has been a lot of thinking. And the Ottoman Empire was something important. It was the caliphate, you know. The Ottoman sultans were not the so-called Caliph Abu Baghdad today, which is chopping of people's heads. The Ottoman sultans were protector of fine arts and Islamic thinking and like Western institutions and everything. So I think it's important to go back and see these examples in Islamic history of change and positive, you know, reinterpretation of the faith. After the Ottoman Empire, what happened was that the Arab world was colonized. Arab countries were expecting to be independent after the Ottoman Empire. Rather than that, they're being colonized. And then the West, European West, became the enemy, you know, the colonizer enemy, and an anti-Western ideological stance emerged. And that trashed out all the liberal ideas as well. And then you had a resurgence of more rigid, reactionary attitudes, which ultimately evolved into what we call Islamism. And in the meantime, also Saudi Arabia, which was always the home of the most rigid interpretation of Sunni Islam, but which was never that important. Saudi Arabia discovered that it is sitting on the world's richest oil reserves, and they thought God gave this money for them to evangelize the whole Muslim world with their own very rigid interpretation of Islam, and that created some of the problems that we have today. Ultimately, I don't want to bore you with all the details, but to the question, is Islam compatible with freedom? I would say it depends. It depends on what you understand from Islam. For me, it is. For millions and millions of Muslims, it is. They just want to worship God in the way they understand, and they should have the right to do that for sure, and they're not a threat to liberty at all. Even if Islam is understood as a legal system, if you go through all these reformations and reinterpretations, you can have an understanding of law, which is about justice, which is about security, which is about values, which is about social justice, which would not be a threat to Islamic law. But there are interpretations of Islam that are obviously authoritarian. And the battle goes on. Just one thing, the same battle went on within Christianity as well for a very long time. I mean, Christian Europe was not a very liberal place for a very long time. You know, heretics were being burned at the stakes, and Inquisition was torturing people for their own souls. It took a lot of thought and effort. People like John Locke had to argue for a religious understanding based on religious liberty, and they laid the grounds for the US Constitution. I mean, that kind of Enlightenment tradition. I think we are right there in the Islamic world today. We're at the time of John Locke, where some people say we should not persecute the heretics. I mean, it's their choice and so on and so forth. But there are people who are towards that direction, and that battle is going on. Ultimately, this is an intra-Islamic issue. So Muslims can deal with this, and non-Muslims cannot come and, you know, reform the religion, right? Or ex-Muslims cannot be reformists. You know, sometimes they trying to do that, which looks a little unconvincing. But my Western friends ask me, so what can we do? Well, one thing to begin with would be not to buy into this narrative that emerged in Europe, in the US lately, which is saying, oh, all Muslims are dangerous people, you know. Like looking at the extremists and then brushing them, you know, painting the whole Muslim community within that brush. That would only help the dark side. That whole confrontation, and which would make Western societies hostile against Islam, and the extremists are saying there are enemies, so that will only confirm their understanding. So just try to understand the nuances. That's why I advise to people when they ask me what should be done. And also, one more thing. when you look at the past 2 centuries of Islamic world, you see actually all these liberalist reformist ideas in 19th century, Muhammad Abduh in Egypt and Nama Kemal in Ottoman Empire. They were pushing these for reformist ideas. And those reformist liberal ideas flourished when Muslims felt more secure and when they had peaceful interactions with the West. The Ottoman Empire had a great era when they were incorporating Western institutions, and Britain and France were allies and friends. They were afraid of Russia most of the time. But when Europe became the enemy after the colonial period, a more rigid, defensive, reactionary attitude grew. So that's why I'm saying, if we want to see a more growingly more liberal, in the classical sense of the word, a more democratic, a more peaceful, a more tolerant Muslim world, we also have to get rid of this big confrontation, because confrontation only strengthens the extremists. That's why I sometimes borrow a slogan from the West. They keep saying, well, it's not a bad slogan, but make love, not war. That's the kind of thing. I say, make conversation, not war. Let's know each other. Let's talk to each other and try to understand the complexities. And rather than thinking that somebody should bomb some places and the problem will be solved. It doesn't solve the problem. It makes things worse. That's why we believe, since I believe in make conversation not war, I'm very, very delightful to Cleveland Book Club for allowing this conversation today. And thanks again for the organizers, and thanks to you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Today we are enjoying a Friday forum at the City Club of Cleveland featuring Mustafa Akyol, author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. We're about to head into the traditional Q&A session, but first we would want to be sure you understand we welcome questions from everyone in the room. Those of you who are joining us via radio or a webcast or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you'd like to tweet a question, I'm reading this, I don't, this is beyond my scope, but if you would like to tweet a question, please tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. As was said before, please make your questions brief and to the point. We've got holding the microphones today, Stephanie Jansky right here, and she's our Director of Programming, and our Marketing and Outreach Fellow, Faye Walker, in the red back here. May we have the first question, please?
Mustafa, great conversation. My question is that in India and Pakistan, before the colonization, the transgender and the homosexuality was much more accepted. It was the British, which I understand, who banned it, and has much more draconian laws were made after that. How that has happened around the world, where the colonial powers have made things much more rigid.
Thank you so much. As I understand, the British also introduced blasphemy laws to Pakistan as well, because they wanted harmony between communities, and if you blaspheme, you would be punished. That was a British invention. So colonialism didn't help many things, and including this particular issue as well. We should also, in certain places, the colonial powers left educational systems and railroads, and okay, we can see that in Malaysia, for example. Some people appreciate that. There's a mixed tradition here, but the result of colonialism has been to generally reject the West, which is okay as a colonial power, but also reject the Western institutions and ideas. So anti-colonial narrative was generally very defensive, nationalist. In the Arab world, it emerged as Arab nationalism, and ultimately it evolved into Islamism. And that's why there's an obsession with the West in our Muslim thought in the past 2 centuries. There's an obsession sometimes to imitate the West and exactly be like them, and to have necessarily wine and dine exactly like the Westerners do, and even impose this by reforms. Like Turkey had a hat reform to where the bowler hat became compulsory by law, which was not a great idea. or just refuse anything. And in the very extreme, it creates these Boko Harams, which ban Western education and people. I think we should just look at our own tradition and look at the world with more self-confidence and learn things from the West, or the Japanese, or Hindus. I mean, there are many civilizations in the world. And Islam was very brilliant in its first centuries because it did learn from other civilizations. We always are proud of our initial bright era of Islam, the Golden Age, where Muslims were the inventors of algebra and many things in mathematics and physics, and Muslim hospitals were better than the rest of the world, which is true. But then that was partly because we were reading Aristotle and discussing about it. So I think we should have a more, like laid-back attitude regarding this obsession, negative or positive, about the West. About the gender issue you asked, like transsexuals or gay people. Muslim societies developed tolerance to social realities over time. I mean, in Ottoman Empire, I mean, it was known that some people were gay, and there was a literature about it. And maybe you didn't get a fatwa which legalized it, but people thought, well, that's life it is, that's fine. In the past century, a more rigid, let's say puritanical attitude grew, and that was partly through actually Wahhabi indoctrination and the spread of that ideology, partly through the emergence of political Islamism, which was a new phenomenon again in the Muslim world, and more rigid attitude grew. In my view, I think Muslims can have conservative opinions about the ideal family, right? Christians have that too sometimes. Some conservative Christians say, we don't think that homosexuality is how God ordained human relations, and they can have moral reservations about that. Muslims, many of them they can have reservations. But to go and attack people for this, go and punish people for this, go and demonize those people would be unthinkable. I generally, when I talk to Muslims, I say, there's also like a male hatred of gays that's coming from some machismo, which is not only a Muslim problem. It's very strong in Russia, Serbia, Armenia. In those countries, there's these kind of tough guys, they go beat gays because they're somehow they think offending male identity or something. That is an ideology in itself, not it's always related to religion. But when I argue against that, like I say, okay, you think gays have a lifestyle that is not acceptable or that's not morally right from your tradition, okay. But there are atheists in the world. I mean, they're even worse, right? They deny God. I mean, their ideas are even... But you can befriend the atheists. You live with them. They can be your neighbor, and you can smile to them. And then you can say, well, I don't share your worldview and philosophy, but we can be neighbors. And so why don't you try to look at that? There are people who would like that. There are people who would be more authoritarian and aggressive. And I think there are certain injunctions in Sharia about this, and I wrote a piece going over those things. How should we read the Quranic story of Sodom and Gomorrah? It's actually coming from the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, which is a biblical, actually, it's coming from there originally, and the Quran reaffirmed the story. And Christians have been able to read the story in different ways. Is it sexual tendency, or is it the sexual aggression that is in the story that is condemned by God? So we have room to think these things. But thanks for pointing out that modernity sometimes made things worse, because it brought something which supposedly looked like more ordering of society, but it increased the authoritarianism. Thank you, sir.
Mustafa, thank you for coming to Cleveland to discuss this important topic. 2 years ago, in May and June of 2014, I was traveling in Turkey with a private group of 8 people. And it was right at the time that the Gezi Park protests broke out, and we observed that we saw evidence of protest, but heard no mention of it in the media for some time, a week or so. And when we traveled...
In Turkish media?
In Turkish media. And actually, I think somewhat the international press was slow to pick up on it too, partly because the Turkish media wasn't covering it. And we observed that as we traveled around the country, there were protests all over the country and in lots of other towns, Bodrum, the capital, Ankara, etc. It seemed to me that there was a very limited conversation between the protesters, i.e., who were mostly young or probably secular, and the people in the PK party and the government, meaning the prime minister at that
AKP?
time. Yeah, APK, who's now the president. And there was really no dialogue about the topic going on. It was just protest and police reaction. And that's what, of course, made the news. No legitimate gripes made the news, it didn't seem. So what is the current situation in Turkey on the Islamic secular discussion and how that's being resolved and worked out, if it is being?
Thank you so much. And so with this question, we're entering the complicated issue of Turkey, another complicated matter. Actually, those protests, Gezi Park protests, in which my brother was an active protester, by the way. He's a hero. He just, stood up for freedom, And those protests and the way the government responded to those protests was, for me, the moment that I said, this government is going nuts, Before that, I was sympathetic to the current government in Turkey in its initial years. It was reformist, it was heading towards EU. But during those protests, which happened in the summer of 2013, here were people angry for different things. Some people were angry that a park in the middle of the city is turning into a shopping mall. Others were angry that Prime Minister insulted people who drink alcohol, He was trying to impose his conservative values in society. Some people were tree huggers and they loved the trees in the park. And people had different things, right? I didn't always agree with their issues either. But they had a right to protest. The government not only disallowed the right to protest, but also said, these are spies working for foreign governments that want to undermine our country. And I said, oh my God, that's not a narrative you hear in a normal liberal democratic country. That's the narrative you hear from Ba'ath governments, basically, to the Arab. This is all conspiracy against our nation. So, and since then, the government in Turkey, and after that, more complications took place in Turkey. The government, especially our president, who's today, in my view, became incredibly paranoid, defensive and aggressive, seeing threats everywhere, and trying to use more state power to overcome those threats, making them worse. Because in the beginning of those protests, if you went to the park and said, what's your problem? You don't want the park to be a shopping mall? That's fine, let's keep the park. There would not be an issue. He said, no, these are spies, and we have to send the police to crack them. He just made everything worse, in my view, if you ask me. And since then, Turkey is in a downward spiral. And it's a democracy. We have free elections, but it's not a liberal democracy. There's a term illiberal democracy where you have elections, but rule of law and freedom of the press is really shrinking. That's what Turkey is today, unfortunately. How much is this related to Islam and the conservative Muslim identity and Islamic or Islamist ideology of the government? To some extent it is, but I think it's more related to universal problems like intoxication by power, arrogance, corruption, nepotism. That's why I'm sometimes saying Turkey is not becoming another Iran when people ask me. It is getting a little bit like another Russia, where you have President Putin, who again does a lot of Christian talk, or Orthodox Christian narrative. But the problem with Putin is that he doesn't allow, independent media. If you're a businessman, if you're a friend of Putin, you prosper. If you're not, some weird things happen to your company. And that is the thing that we're seeing in Turkey, unfortunately. And if you read my book, Turkey Chapter, you would see that in 2011, I had much better hopes. So the only chapter in my book which is outdated now is the Turkey chapter. It needs a big update. And there, unfortunately, things got bad. Still, I'm glad I'm living in Turkey and not other countries in the region. We have tough neighbors. Our longest border is with Syria. It was with Canada, as you guys have, but I hope it was. So that's the case I can say about the situation in Turkey. And we need to overcome this phase where we have a leader who is venerated by half of society and hated by the other half, and that leader is also demonizing that half. So it's a very polarized seed. We need somebody to overcome this polarization and bring some dialogue and conversation rather than chest beating. We Turks love chest beating for some reason, but we have to grow up, I think, at that point. Thank you.
Yeah, my name is George Kusa. I'm with Margaret W. Wang and Associates, and my role is I serve as the public relations person and the advisor on the cultural issues and religious about the Middle East and the Arab countries. And my objective is how to break down cultural and religious barriers to human interactions and to understand more the cultures of the people we deal with, and that would apply to, of course, all the diverse cultures in the area. So my question is about the interpretation and the understanding and the perception that people have, especially about some major definitions in the Holy Quran, like the verses, and you touched on that during your talk, like the definition of Islam. A lot of people who never even read the Holy Quran or had no exposure to people from Turkey, from Syria, for instance, like me, and about the Middle East and the Muslim religion, they see it as sometimes they say, Islam is submission by force, but the meaning of Islam is peace. So where do we refer these people, the general public, to the specific or precise definition or interpretation of the meaning of, this great religion, the peaceful religion, not the submission by force and sword as they interpret from the media, by the way, the stereotypes in the media, we see a lot of that. Also the conception of jihad. Also, people interpret holy war as it's now taken by extremists and things. Yeah. So we know that, the jihad in Islam, which I read in Arabic, my native language, and with translations, that you can struggle in life and in your marriage and your job to be a successful business person or role model to your children and family. So again, to narrow it down, where do we refer people to the exact verse like hadith you mentioned and other, that people will be aware of the exact and precise meaning of these great values?
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Very important questions. First of all, does Islam mean submission? It can mean submission. It can mean peace. The word salam has different interpretations of Islam. But if it means submission, it is a willing submission to God. It's a willing obedience to God. And to be able to do that, you need freedom first. You need freedom to be able to make the choice of rendering your, self to God's will. Therefore, if submission means you willingly do that. It's not that somebody's forcing you to do that. In other words, like today, Muslims submit God's authority and they don't eat in Ramadan. Are they sacrificing their freedom? Their freedom to eat, yes, but they're doing this willingly, so they're not sacrificing their freedom. They're using their freedom to have a religious practice. So, of course, if submission is by force, if you force people to be Muslims, to become Muslims, or to be Muslims in the way you understand, that's where the problem starts. And I think the Quran doesn't give us a vision like that. Like you should force people to become Muslims or make them better Muslims by enforcing them. But we have that kind of attitudes in our Islamic history, and they sometimes define certain understandings. Like Christians had some, enforcements throughout their history, and they had to go through rethinking to overcome those. One thing about Islam, though, a little bit different than Christianity. Christianity was a religion of a small religious community in Palestine. When Jesus was crucified and he passed away, there was just a small group of people. And Christianity was, again, a civil community until the 4th century when it became the religion of Rome. Islam became a state religion very quickly, in the very beginning. And that had everlasting consequences. And Muslims started to think Islam and state always linked. And I think that's a legacy we have to untackle and we have to deal with and we have to understand today. Did Islam spread by the sword? People ask that a lot. Like, was Islam a religion of the sword? That concept. Muslims conquered territories. That's true. But they didn't force people to become Muslims. Like big Islamic empires stretching from Spain to Yemen, just in 1 century, Muslims created these big. Ottoman Empire went all the way to Vienna. But it's important that they conquered the place they wanted, and what's that empires do, right? They wanted glory and power. So it was not actually religious in my view. It was a matter of, they used religious slogans, of course. But important to note is that they did not force Jews and Christians to become Muslims. That's why you have Arab Christians today in Palestine, in Syria, in Egypt. That's why Serbs, Bulgarians, Armenians lived as Christians under Ottoman rule for 6 centuries. And when Armenians were horrifically wiped out in 1915, that was not because of Islam, that was because of the rising nationalism in a crumbling empire. So we should underline that, I think, that in terms of, but what does jihad mean? I mean, the other, even more important question. Well, jihad can mean struggle. It's in Arabic, jahd is to do struggle. It can mean spiritual struggle, it can mean intellectual struggle, but it can mean armed struggle too. So in Islam, we have an idea of war, with the sword. That is true, we can't deny that. But, very important point, in classical medieval Islam, jihad as war was always a battle between armies. When the Ottomans were having jihad with the Austro-Hungarians, soldiers were fighting with each other on a battlefield. It never meant attacks on civilian people. It never meant attacks on innocent people. Actually, there are rules in classical Islam that civilians cannot be targeted in jihad, because there's a verse in the Quran which says, fight in the name of God, but do not go against the limits. There's a saying attributed to the Prophet which says, fight in the name of God, but do not kill women, children, the elderly, the monks, don't cut down trees. So it had its like a just war idea with certain rules. The tragedy today is that since the 80s, and not before that, since the 80s, certain extremist thinkers, Salafi jihadism as we call it, emerged saying that, no, we can attack civilians too. They did this by overriding all the classical fatwas, and that's why they were condemned by mainstream scholars, but they opened the way. And they took techniques like suicide bombing from Tamil Tigers, for example, and they combined it, they called this jihad. So what I'm saying is that today the group called themselves jihadists are bastardizing the concept of jihad. Jihad means if your country is occupied, it's invaded by a hostile army, you can defend it, you can defend your land by fighting with the army that is attacking you. But it can never mean going and killing innocent people in the middle of New York, Paris, Istanbul, or Ankara. But that is the unfortunate thing that's going on today. So we should claim the concept of jihad from those extremists who justify these things. Al-Qaeda opened that way, basically, and ISIS took it to a bigger extreme. That's what I would say about that. My book, Chapter 3, explains these really in detail, and you can check it out. Sure.
It seems the implication is that authoritarian regimes like Saudi Arabia use a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam as a way of propping up their power. Is that correct? And
Absolutely.
And if so, can you have a change in a more liberalization of religion without a earlier or concomitant change in the power structure?
Very wise question. Probably not. That's why the matter is war of ideas and also the political and cultural context of those ideas. If you have regimes that benefit from authoritarian interpretations of Islam, they justify themselves through those interpretations of Islam, then the problem becomes a political problem. How do you deal with those regimes? Plus, if those regimes have enormous wealth thanks to oil, and they can subsidize their citizens and buy their loyalty, you are in a bigger trouble. So, yes, the problem is big in that sense. And it's not just a matter of ideas, it's about how those ideas flourish. But it is also important that even in Saudi society, there is now a younger generation which question these authoritarianisms. There was a Saudi movement online a couple of years ago. Mostly people educated outside, so they see the world out there. And they initiated this campaign that we don't want religious police, right? Because in Saudi Arabia, there's this institution called the religious or religion police, Mutawwa. Their job is to go around and check whether you're doing your headscarf and whether you're going to the mosque at the right time, whether you're fasting or not. If you are eating in Ramadan, they could, put you in jail. They say, we don't need this. This is hypocrisy. I mean, we want to pray, but not because the government is telling us. We want to pray because we want to. Or if we don't want, we don't want. So the government should not. So even in Saudi Arabia, you have these currents. And I think ultimately, The more Muslim world globalizes, internet, the world, travel, see the outside world, and that will help, and that is helping, I think. In most Muslim societies, you have a tendency towards, in the younger generation. Sometimes it leads to very other extreme. So, I mean, globalization has bad effects too, but also it raises a more educated middle class, which start to question these systems and institutions and ideas. Great. Great, thank you.
Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum with Mustafa Akyol, author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty. Today's forum is the Margaret W. Wong Endowed Forum on Foreign-Born Individuals of Distinction, which was made possible by a very generous endowment gift from Margaret Wong. She could not be with us today, we're sorry to say, but we deeply appreciate her support. Our community partners for today's forum are the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Niagara Foundation, and the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies. Our hospitality partner is the Metropolitan at the 9 Hotel. We thank all of you for your partnership. And in addition, we'd like to welcome the guests at tables hosted by Jones Day and by Margaret Wong, and we thank all of you for joining us today. The sale of Mr. Akyol's book, Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, is provided by A Cultural Exchange. So that brings us to the end of today's forum. We want to thank you very much, Mr. Akyol. We want to thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned. Go Cavs!
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream are made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.